Racist teacher throws mud at black girl's hair. Unaware her father was watching a schoolyard incident exposes deep prejudices, but the girl's father, watching from a distance, is about to step in. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The outdoor class at Los Angeles Elementary started like any other spring morning. The air was crisp, and the playground buzzed with the sound of third-grade students gathering for Mrs. Thompson's special activity session. The teacher had planned what she thought would be an engaging outdoor lesson, something different from their usual classroom routine. Mrs. Thompson stood near the playground's edge, her lesson plan clutched in one hand while she gestured with the other, directing students to form a circle. She wore her typical teaching attire, a floral dress and comfortable shoes, her graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. The students, aged 8 and 9, shuffled into position, their excited chatter filling the morning air. Among them was Maya Johnson, a bright-eyed third grader wearing her hair in carefully styled braids that her father David had done for her that morning. Maya stood out in the group, not just for her infectious energy, but for the way she actively engaged with everyone around her. She raised her hand for every question, smiled at her classmates, and showed the kind of enthusiasm teachers usually dream of seeing in their students. The activity started simple enough. Mrs. Thompson had designed an outdoor science lesson about soil composition, incorporating elements of play to keep the children engaged. The students gathered around different patches of earth, examining the differences between dry soil, wet soil, and clay. Their laughter echoed across the playground as they made observations and took notes in their science journals. Other classes could see them from their windows, and several parents who had arrived early for a scheduled parent-teacher meeting watched from the parking lot. Among them was David Johnson, Maya's father, who had taken time off from his consulting job to attend the meeting. He stood near his car, checking emails on his phone, occasionally glancing up to watch his daughter participate in the class activity. The situation shifted when Mrs. Thompson decided to make the lesson more interactive. She picked up a handful of mud from one of the demonstration areas, intending to show its consistency. What happened next occurred in slow motion for those watching. Instead of simply displaying the mud, Mrs. Thompson, in what she would later claim was an attempt to make the lesson more entertaining, playfully tossed it toward the students. The mud landed directly in Maya's hair, clumping in her braids and dripping down onto her school uniform. The playground fell silent. The laughter that had filled the air moments before died instantly. Maya stood frozen, mud sliding down her carefully styled hair that represented hours of careful work and cultural significance. Some students gasped. Others didn't know how to react. A few nervous giggles broke out, quickly silenced by the gravity of the moment. Maya's hand slowly reached up to touch her hair, her fingers coming away dirty. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't make a sound. The pride and confidence she had shown minutes earlier crumbled visibly. Mrs. Thompson's face shifted from playful enthusiasm to horror as she realized what she had done. She rushed forward with paper towels, making the situation worse as she tried to clean Maya's hair, causing the mud to spread further into the braids. Her attempts at helping only served to draw more attention to the incident, and her rushed apologies came out as frustrated mumbles. From the parking lot, David Johnson had looked up from his phone just in time to witness the incident. His body tensed, and his phone dropped to his side, forgotten. He watched as his daughter stood there, humiliated, while her teacher made clumsy attempts to fix what she had done. The other parents who had gathered for the meeting also watched, their expressions a mix of shock and concern. The playground had become eerily quiet, save for the sound of Mrs. Thompson's increasingly panicked apologies and Maya's now audible sniffles. The other students had backed away, forming a circle around Maya and their teacher, turning what was meant to be a fun science lesson into an uncomfortable spectacle that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. David Johnson's feet moved before his mind could fully process what he had just witnessed. The distance between the parking lot and the playground seemed to stretch endlessly as he walked with measured steps, his jaw clenched tight. 20 years of corporate experience had taught him to maintain composure in tense situations. But this was different. This involved Maya. His daughter's tears cut through him like physical pain. As he approached, he could see the mud had thoroughly saturated sections of Maya's braids. Braids he had spent an hour carefully crafting that morning while they talked about her upcoming science presentation. Each step he took was accompanied by a memory. Maya sitting patiently while he learned to braid from YouTube videos after her mother passed. The pride in her eyes when she saw herself in the mirror each morning, the conversations they had about embracing her natural hair despite pressure to change it. Mrs. Thompson continued her fumbling attempts to clean Maya's hair, making everything worse with each touch. She kept repeating, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to," while other students watched in uncomfortable silence. David noticed how some of them shifted their weight from foot to foot, how others whispered behind their hands. He'd seen that behavior before. The subtle ways people reacted to incidents they knew were wrong, but didn't know how to address. "Maya," David called out, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. His daughter turned, and the relief on her face at seeing him there made his heart clench. He knelt down to her level, a habit he'd developed years ago when he wanted her to feel secure. "Are you okay, baby?" he asked, though he could clearly see she wasn't. Mrs. Thompson straightened up immediately, her face flushed. She was a veteran teacher, respected in the school community, but at this moment she looked like a rookie who had made a terrible mistake. "Mr. Johnson, I was just trying to make the lesson fun. I didn't think dash. That's exactly the problem." David cut her off, his voice low but firm. "You didn't think." He pulled out a clean handkerchief from his pocket and gently began wiping Maya's face, trying to salvage what he could of her hair. Years of being one of few black executives in his firm had taught him to choose his words carefully, to maintain control even when everything inside him wanted to explode. The playground had grown silent except for Maya's occasional sniffles. David could feel the weight of every eye on them. The students, the other parents who had gathered for the meeting, even the faces watching from classroom windows. This was no longer just about mud in his daughter's hair. This was about something much deeper, something that had been building in the school community for longer than Maya had been a student here. As he stood up, David felt a familiar weight settle onto his shoulders. It was the same weight he carried into board meetings where he was the only person of color, the same weight he felt when explaining to Maya why some people treated them differently. He turned to face Mrs. Thompson, who had taken a step back, perhaps reading the controlled anger in his posture. Other parents had begun to drift closer, drawn by the tension in the air. David noticed their expressions, some sympathetic, others defensive, a few clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation building before them. He had seen these expressions before too, had cataloged them over years of similar incidents, both minor and major. Maya gripped his hand tightly, and in that grip, he felt her trust, her need for him to make this right. It wasn't just about today's incident. It was about every future incident that might happen if he didn't address this one properly. He thought about all the times he'd told Maya to stand up for herself, to be proud of who she was. Now it was time to demonstrate what that looked like. A woman from the gathering crowd caught his attention. She was watching the scene with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what was happening. David would later learn this was Carla, another parent who had her own history of confronting discrimination in the school system. But for now, she was just another witness to what was about to unfold. David took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The corporate professional in him wanted to handle this diplomatically, to find a solution that wouldn't make waves. But the father in him, the man who had promised to protect his daughter, knew that sometimes waves were necessary for change to occur. The time for diplomatic silence had passed the moment that mud hit Maya's hair. Carla Martinez stepped forward from the crowd, her heels clicking purposefully against the playground pavement. As the mother of Elena, a fifth grader who had faced her own share of discriminatory accidents at the school, she recognized the look in David's eyes. It was the same look she'd seen in her mirror countless times, the careful balance between rage and restraint. "Mr. Johnson," she called out, her voice clear and professional. Carla worked as a civil rights attorney, though few at the school knew this. She had learned to keep her credentials quiet, finding that people became defensive when they learned her occupation. "I'm Elena's mother. We need to talk about what just happened." The other parents watched as Carla positioned herself next to David, creating a united front that changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Mrs. Thompson's nervous fidgeting increased as she realized she now faced not one, but two parents who weren't going to let this incident slide with a simple apology. 3 months ago, Carla began, keeping her voice low enough that only David and Mrs. Thompson could hear. My daughter Elena was told her Spanish was too authentic for the school play and was given a smaller role. Last month, she was asked to tone down her cultural presentation because it made some students uncomfortable. She paused, letting the pattern sink in. This isn't just about mud in Maya's hair, is it, Mrs. Thompson? David glanced at Carla, recognition flowing between them. They had never met before, but they shared the exhausting experience of navigating these small incidents that built up over time. Maya still held his hand, but she had stopped crying, watching the adults with growing interest. More parents began gravitating toward their position, forming a loose semicircle. Among them were faces David recognized from PTA meetings, parents who had always stayed silent during discussions about diversity and inclusion. But something about this moment was different. Perhaps it was the visible evidence of the mud in Maya's hair, or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which David and Carla stood their ground. Mrs. Thompson attempted to regain control of the situation. I think we're blowing this out of proportion. It was just a harmless activity dash. Harmless? Carla interrupted, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. Do you know how long it takes to properly braid and maintain black hair? Do you understand the cultural significance? Or did you just see it as a convenient target for your fun activity? David placed a steadying hand on Carla's arm, appreciating her passion but recognizing the need to maintain in tactical advantage. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar conversations, we're not here to attack you. We're here because this needs to be a moment of change. Other students had begun to gather closer, despite attempts by teaching assistants to direct them away. Among them was Elena, Carla's daughter, who stood tall with understanding beyond her years. She moved to stand near Maya, offering silent support that spoke volumes about the alliance forming not just between their parents, but between the next generation. The school principal, Dr. Roberts, emerged from the building, having been alerted to the situation. He approached with the cautious air of someone who had handled similar situations before, always with an eye toward minimizing conflict rather than addressing root causes. But as he neared the group, he read the room and realized this time would be different. Carla pulled out her phone, fingers moving swiftly across the screen. I'm documenting this incident, she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not because we want to cause trouble, but because these small incidents keep happening, and they keep being brushed aside. The alliance between David and Carla had shifted the power dynamic completely. What might have been dismissed as an overreaction by one parent had become something larger, a moment of community recognition and potential change. Other parents of color in the crowd began nodding, some stepping forward to join them. Mrs. Thompson's face had lost its defensive edge, replaced by growing understanding of the severity of her actions. The principal stopped a few feet away, realizing that his usual peacekeeping approach wouldn't suffice. This wasn't a situation that could be resolved with a quick apology and a promise to do better. The playground had become eerily quiet, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. Maya and Elena exchanged glances, witnessing their parents stand together against something bigger than a single incident with mud. This unexpected alliance between David and Carla had transformed a moment of humiliation into something powerful, the beginning of a long-overdue conversation about respect, understanding, and genuine inclusion in their school community. David stepped forward, his posture straight but not aggressive. Years of corporate negotiations had taught him that the most powerful confrontations happen with controlled precision rather than explosive anger. Mrs. Thompson, he began, his voice carrying across the now silent playground, I want you to understand exactly what happened here today. He gestured to Maya's hair, still dripping with mud. These braids represent 2 hours of morning time between a father and daughter. They represent culture, identity, and self-respect. But more importantly, they represent trust. Trust that when my daughter comes to school, she'll be treated with dignity. Carla stood beside him, her legal pad now in hand, taking detailed notes. The crowd had grown, with teachers peering out of classroom windows and more parents arriving for the scheduled meetings. The principal, Dr. Roberts, remained frozen in place, recognizing that any attempt to minimize or deflect this confrontation would only make things worse. "This isn't the first time," David continued, his voice steady but intense. "Maya came home last month asking to straighten her hair because someone said it looked unprofessional. The month before that, she was told her beaded braids were too distracting during class presentations." He paused, letting each example land with deliberate weight. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed deeper red. "I never meant. I would never intentionally," she stammered, but Carla cut her off. "Intent isn't the issue here," Carla interjected, her attorney's precision evident in every word. "Impact is, and the impact of these unintentional actions creates a pattern that ages our children's sense of self-worth and belonging." More parents of color moved forward to stand with David and Carla. Among them was Mrs. Chun, whose son had been mocked for bringing traditional Chinese lunches, and Mr. Patel, whose daughter had been repeatedly passed over for leading roles in school plays despite her obvious talent. Maya, who had been quiet throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up. Her voice was shaky but determined. "It's not just today," she said, drawing everyone's attention. "Sometimes people touch my hair without asking. They make comments. They make me feel different, but not in a good way." The playground fell even quieter at Maya's words. David felt his throat tighten. This was the first time Maya had publicly voiced these experiences. Elena, Carla's daughter, moved closer to Maya in solidarity. Mrs. Thompson's defensive posture crumbled entirely. I didn't realize," she began, but David raised his hand. "That's exactly the problem," he said firmly. "You didn't realize because you didn't have to realize. You didn't have to think about how throwing mud would affect a black child's hair specifically. You didn't have to consider the message it sends when you single out the only black girl in class for this kind of fun." Carla stepped forward, her legal training evident in her measured tone. "We have documented 17 incidents this semester alone where students of color were subjected to what you might call unintentional discriminatory actions. Each time, it was dismissed as a misunderstanding or an accident." The principal finally found his voice. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my office. No," David said firmly. "This happens here now in front of everyone, because everyone needs to understand that these small incidents aren't small to our children. They build up, day after day, creating wounds that don't heal because they're never properly acknowledged." Other students had gathered closer, watching with wide eyes as the adults confronted issues they themselves had felt but couldn't articulate. The teaching assistants had stopped trying to herd them away, recognizing the educational value of this moment. Mrs. Thompson, her usual confidence completely shattered, looked at Maya with new eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, this time with genuine understanding rather than defensive panic. "I'm sorry for not thinking, for not understanding, for making assumptions that hurt you." But David wasn't finished. "An apology isn't enough," he stated. "We need change. Real, structural change in how this school addresses diversity and inclusion. No more brushing things under the rug. No more dismissing our children's experiences as oversensitivity." The confrontation had transformed from a single incident into a watershed moment for the entire school community. The air was thick with tension, but also with possibility. The possibility of genuine understanding and change. Maya stood straighter now. Her initial humiliation transformed into a kind of quiet pride as she watched her father and their newfound allies stand up for something bigger than themselves. The conversation shifted as parents and teachers began pulling chairs from nearby classrooms, forming an impromptu forum in the playground. Dr. Roberts, recognizing he couldn't contain this moment, finally made a productive decision. "Let's use this opportunity," he announced, his administrative tone giving way to something more genuine. "Everyone who wants to speak will be heard." David remained standing, Maya now sitting between him and Carla. The mud in her hair had begun to dry, serving as a visible reminder of why they were all there. Parents who had never spoken at school meetings began raising their hands, sharing stories they'd previously kept silent. Mrs. Lee, a usually quiet parent, spoke first. "Last week, my son was told his English was surprisingly good by a substitute teacher, she aide. Her accent thick, but her words precise. He was born in Los Angeles. He's never lived anywhere else. But people here keep treating him like a foreigner. The floodgates opened. One by one, parents began sharing experiences that painted a pattern. A Muslim student being accidentally excluded from holiday celebrations. A Hispanic child being automatically placed in ESL classes despite English being her first language. An Indian student being told his curry lunches smelled too strong for the cafeteria. Mrs. Thompson sat in the circle, her face a study in dawning recognition. Each story seemed to hit her differently, as if pieces of a puzzle she'd never noticed were finally forming a clear picture. She no longer attempted to defend herself, instead listening with increasing distress to the impact of what she and others had dismissed as minor incidents. Carla, maintaining her role as documenter, spoke up. What we're hearing isn't just about isolated incidents. It's about a systemic failure to recognize and address microaggressions that affect our children daily. She turned to Dr. Roberts. The school's diversity policy looks good on paper, but where's the actual training? Where's the accountability? A white parent, Mrs. Anderson, raised her hand hesitantly. I never realized. I've seen some of these things happen, but I didn't want to make a scene. I should have said something. That's part of the problem, David responded, his voice firm but not unkind. Silence from allies feels like agreement to those experiencing discrimination. We need everyone engaged in this conversation. The discussion continued, becoming more structured as parents and teachers began offering concrete suggestions. Mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, regular community forums to address concerns before they escalate, a revised curriculum that better reflected the student body's diversity, clear protocols for reporting and addressing discriminatory incidents. Dr. Roberts, who had been taking notes, finally spoke up. I want to be clear, this isn't just about making promises. We need actionable steps and accountability measures. He paused, looking directly at Maya. And we need to start by acknowledging that we've failed some of our students. Mrs. Thompson, who had been quietly crying, stood up. The playground fell silent. I've been teaching for 20 years, she began, her voice shaking. I've always prided myself on treating all students equally. But I'm realizing that treating everyone the same isn't the same as treating everyone equitably. The conversation shifted again as teachers began sharing their own struggles with unconscious bias and their desire for better training. Even those who had initially seemed defensive began engaging in the dialogue, asking questions about how they could do better. Maya, who had been listening intently, raised her hand. The adults fell silent as she spoke. I just want to feel like I belong here, she said simply. Like who I am is okay. Like my hair and my culture and everything about me isn't something that needs to be fixed or changed. Her words hung in the air, cutting through all the adult complexity to the heart of the matter. David placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, feeling simultaneously proud of her courage and heartbroken that she had to be courageous about something so fundamental. The conversation had evolved from confrontation to collaboration, but the tension hadn't fully dissipated. Every person present understood that this was just the beginning of a longer, more challenging dialogue. The easy part was acknowledging the problem. The harder part would be maintaining the momentum for real change. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the playground, Dr. Roberts stood up again. This conversation doesn't end here, he announced. Tomorrow morning, I want proposals on my desk for concrete changes. We'll establish a diversity and inclusion committee, and I want representation from every part of our school community. The gathering began to disperse, but something had fundamentally shifted in the school's atmosphere. Parents who had never spoken to each other were exchanging phone numbers. Teachers were scheduling informal meetings to discuss curriculum changes. What had started as a horrible incident was transforming into a catalyst for long overdue change. As the impromptu meeting dispersed, small groups lingered in the parking lot, their conversations intense and purposeful. David stood with Maya at their car, helping her clean the remaining mud from her hair with bottled water and emergency supplies from his glove compartment. The physical evidence of the incident was washing away, but its impact continued to ripple through the school community. Carlo approached them, her legal pad now filled with notes and action items. "This isn't over," she said, showing David a detailed list of incidents she'd documented during the meeting. "What happened today broke something open. People are finally talking about what they've been afraid to mention for years." Parents were clustered in various groups across the parking lot, many wiping tears from their eyes or nodding vigorously in conversation. Mrs. Thompson sat alone in her car, visibly shaken, staring at her steering wheel. Through her windshield, they could see her shoulders shaking with sobs. "Dad," Maya said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "I want to help." She stood straighter, the last drops of water running from her hair. "Elena told me she's going to start a student group. Can I join?" David looked at his daughter, seeing something new in her expression. The humiliation from earlier had transformed into determination. He remembered feeling this way himself in college, the first time he'd stood up against institutional racism. It was both inspiring and heartbreaking to see his 11-year-old daughter reaching this moment of awakening. "Of course you can," he replied, sharing a knowing look with Carla. "But you understand this won't be easy. Some people might not want things to change." Maya nodded, her expression serious. "I know, but staying quiet is harder." Across the parking lot, other transformations were taking place. Mrs. Anderson, the white parent who had admitted her previous silence, was organizing a Signal chat group for parents committed to being active allies. Mr. Patel, who had barely spoken at previous PTA meetings, was now confidently leading a discussion about cultural celebration days. Dr. Roberts emerged from the building, looking exhausted but determined. He walked directly to David's car. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his administrator's facade cracking slightly. "I've been principal here for 8 years. I thought we were doing enough with our diversity statements and cultural heritage months. I was wrong." The admission hung in the air, heavy with implications. Carla pulled out a fresh page in her legal pad. "We need concrete actions, not just acknowledgments," she stated firmly. "I agree," Dr. Roberts replied, surprising them both. "I've been on the phone with the school board. They're sending a crisis management team, but I told them that's not what we need. We need structural change." Maya listened to the adults talking, then turned to her father. "Can we fix my braids before tomorrow? I want to come to school looking extra nice." The simple request carried layers of meaning: defiance, pride, resilience. "We'll do them even better than before," David promised, feeling a complex mix of emotions. He was proud of his daughter's strength, but angry that she needed to be strong in this way, at this age. Mrs. Thompson finally emerged from her car, her eyes red but her posture determined. She walked toward them slowly, stopping a respectful distance away. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hoarse. "I don't just want to apologize. I want to learn, really learn." The parking lot had nearly emptied now, but the energy of change lingered in the air. Parents were leaving with plans to return, with commitments to act, with a new awareness of their role in either maintaining or challenging the status quo. Carla checked her phone, which had been buzzing continuously. The local education board got wind of what happened. "They want to use our school as a pilot program for new diversity initiatives." She looked up at David. "They're asking if we'd be willing to lead it." Maya beamed at her father, but David felt the weight of the request. He knew from experience that being a catalyst for change often meant becoming a target. Yet looking at his daughter's face, seeing the mix of hope and determination there, he knew his answer. "We'll do it," he said, "but not alone. This has to be a community effort." As the sun set on what had begun as a typical school day, the awakening that had started with mud in Maya's hair was spreading, transforming individual awareness into collective commitment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but something fundamental had shifted. The silence had been broken, and in its place, new voices were rising, ready to speak truths that had been too long unspoken. The following days saw Los Angeles Elementary transformed into a hub of unprecedented activity. The school library, usually quiet after hours, now hummed with voices as parents, teachers, and community leaders gathered for the first official meeting of the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Every chair was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. David sat at the front table alongside Carla, both of them surrounded by stacks of papers and open laptops. The committee had received over 200 emails in 3 days. Stories from current and former students, offers of support from local organizations, and even messages from other schools asking for guidance on starting their own initiatives. "We need to address this systematically," Carla announced, projecting a spreadsheet onto the library wall. "I've categorized the reported incidents from the past 2 years. The patterns are clear. The data showed what many had suspected but few had documented. A consistent trend of minor discriminatory incidents that, taken together, painted a picture of systemic bias. Teachers who had initially been defensive now sat in the front row, taking notes. Mrs. Thompson, who had requested to be part of the committee despite her role in the inciting incident, raised her hand. "I've been researching cultural competency training programs," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension. "Several local universities offer certification courses for educators." The meeting proceeded with unexpected efficiency. Parents who had never participated in school governance were now leading discussions about curriculum reform. Mr. Patel, drawing on his experience as a software engineer, proposed an anonymous reporting system for students to document concerning incidents. Mrs. Lee offered to translate all school communications into multiple languages. In the back of the room, Maya and Elena had set up their own table. They'd started a student advisory group, already 20 members strong, with kids from every grade level. They were creating posters for a Culture Share Day, their artistic efforts spreading across several tables. "The school board representative will be here next week," Dr. Roberts announced, looking both tired and energized. "They're interested in using our new protocols as a model for other schools in the district." He paused, glancing at David. "They're particularly interested in our community-led approach." The meeting shifted to concrete action items. Weekly diversity training sessions for all staff members. Monthly community forums open to parents and students. Curriculum review MITs for each grade level. New hiring practices to increase staff diversity. Regular cultural celebration events planned by student committees outside the library. Local news vans have begun appearing. The story of how a mud-throwing incident had sparked a school-wide reformation was attracting attention. David had already turned down several interview requests, insisting that the focus remain on systemic change rather than personal drama. Mrs. Anderson stood up, holding a thick folder. "I've been in contact with parents from neighboring schools," she announced. "They want to know how they can implement similar programs. I think we need to document our process, create a kind of template." The energy in the room shifted as people realized the potential impact of their work could extend far beyond their own school. Carla was already typing, creating an outline for a shareable framework. "We need to be careful, though," she cautioned. "This isn't about creating a one-size-fits-all solution. Each community needs to adapt these ideas to their own context." Maya raised her hand from the back of the room. When acknowledged, she stood, her voice clear and confident. "We want to start a podcast," she announced, gesturing to her student group, "to share our stories and talk about what it's really like. Elena's dad works in radio, and he said he'd help us." The adults in the room fell silent, struck by the initiative these children were showing. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. Just days ago, Maya had been in tears over the mud in her hair. Now she was helping to lead a movement. As the meeting continued, new people kept arriving. A local civil rights organization sent representatives. Teachers from other schools showed up during their free periods. Parents who had initially been skeptical began contributing ideas. Mrs. Thompson, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke again. "I've been thinking about how we can prevent others from making the mistakes I made," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe we need to document my incident. Use it as a teaching tool. Show how unconscious bias can surface in unexpected ways." The offer hung in the air, a testament to how much had changed in just a few days. David looked at Carla, who nodded subtly. Using Mrs. Thompson's experience as a case study could be powerful, especially coming from her own perspective. As the meeting wound down, Dr. Roberts made one final announcement. "The school board has approved emergency funding for our initiatives," he said. "They want us to succeed. They want to learn from what we're doing here." The library slowly emptied, but the conversations continued into the parking lot, spilled over into text messages and email chains. What had started as a response to a single incident had grown into something much larger, a community awakening to its power to create change. 3 weeks after the incident, Los Angeles Elementary looked different. Physical changes were immediately visible. Student artwork celebrating different cultures lined the hallways. Multilingual welcome signs adorned the entrance, and the library had a new section dedicated to diverse authors and perspectives. But the deeper transformations were happening beneath the surface. The first major test of the new systems came during a tense staff meeting. Half the teachers sat on one side of the room, resistant to what they called excessive changes, while the other half advocated for even more comprehensive reforms. Dr. Roberts stood at the front, facilitating what had become a heated debate about curriculum overhaul. "We can't change everything overnight," argued Mr. Peterson, a veteran math teacher. "We have standards to meet, tests to prepare for. All these new cultural inclusion requirements are eating into our instructional time." Carla, who had been invited as a parent representative, responded with data in hand. "Our research shows that students perform better academically when they feel represented and respected in their learning environment. This isn't extra work, it's essential work." The tension in the room was palpable until Mrs. Thompson stood up. Her voice shook slightly, but her words carried weight. "3 weeks ago, I thought I was one of the good ones. I thought treating everyone the same meant I wasn't part of the problem. I was wrong." She turned to face her colleagues. "Every minute we spend resisting these changes is another minute we're failing our students." The resistance didn't disappear entirely, but it began to crack. Teachers who had been skeptical started asking practical questions about implementation rather than questioning the need for change. The conversation shifted from why to how. Meanwhile, the student initiatives were gaining momentum. Maya and Elena's podcast, Our Voice, Our School, had released its first episode featuring interviews with students about their experiences. The honest, unfiltered stories hit harder than any adult presentation could have. Teachers who listened found themselves questioning practices they'd never thought twice about before. David, now chairing the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, faced his own challenges. Some parents complained that the changes were too radical, too fast. Others argued they weren't happening quickly enough. Finding the balance between urgency and sustainability became his daily struggle. In the classrooms, the transformation manifested in various ways. History lessons now included perspectives from multiple cultural viewpoints. Science classes highlighted contributions from diverse scientists. Literature selections reflected a broader range of experiences. Math word problems incorporated cultural contexts from different communities. Art classes explored techniques and traditions from around the world, but not everything went smoothly. During a parent forum, tension erupted when Mrs. Whitman, a longtime PTA member, complained about resources being diverted from traditional programs. "We're spending so much time and money on these new initiatives," she protested. "What about the programs that were working fine before?" It was Maya who responded, stepping forward with unexpected poise. "But they weren't working fine for everyone," she said simply. "They were just working fine for some people." The room fell silent. Maya's words, delivered without anger or accusation, seemed to resonate even with those who had been resistant to change. Dr. Roberts quickly wrote her statement down. It would later become part of the school's new mission statement. The transformation extended beyond policies and procedures. Small moments revealed deeper changes. Teachers began asking students how to properly pronounce their names instead of defaulting to anglicized versions. Staff meetings now opened with acknowledgement of whose ancestral land the school occupied. The cafeteria started offering diverse meal options, celebrating different culinary traditions. Parent communications went out in multiple languages. With cultural context considered, student achievements were recognized through a broader lens of success. Mrs. Thompson, working to rebuild trust, threw herself into leading by example. She enrolled in advanced cultural competency courses and began sharing her learning journey openly, turning her mistake into a powerful testimony for change. Yet challenges remained. Some teachers struggled to adapt their teaching styles. Some parents continued to resist what they saw as unnecessary changes. The school board, while supportive, pressed for measurable results to justify the resources being allocated to these initiatives. During a particularly difficult committee meeting, David reminded everyone of their purpose. "We're not just changing policies," he said. "We're changing the experience of being a student here. We're changing what it means to belong." The transformation of Los Angeles Elementary became a case study in both the possibility and complexity of institutional change. Every success was hard-won, every setback a lesson in persistence. But slowly, steadily, the school was becoming what it had always claimed to be, a place where every student could thrive. 6 months after the mud incident, Los Angeles Elementary hosted its first Cultural Unity Festival. The playground, where everything had started, was now transformed into a vibrant celebration space. Families from different cultural backgrounds set up booths, sharing their traditions, food, and stories. The turnout exceeded everyone's expectations, with lines stretching into the parking lot. Maya stood on the makeshift stage, her confidence evident as she addressed the crowd. Her hair was styled in elaborate braids adorned with traditional beads, a style she now wore proudly, without fear of commentary or unwanted attention. Beside her, Elena helped manage the student-led presentation schedule they had organized. "Welcome to our first, but definitely not last, Cultural Unity Festival," Maya began, her voice clear through the microphone. "6 months ago, something happened on this playground that changed our school. Today, we're standing here to show what change looks like." The impact of the past months was visible everywhere. Students moved between cultural booths with genuine curiosity, asking questions and engaging respectfully with different traditions. Teachers participated actively, many showing off what they'd learned in their cultural competency training. The school's test scores had improved, particularly among minority students who reported feeling more engaged in their classes. Bullying incidents had decreased by 60%, according to Dr. Roberts' latest report. Student attendance rates were up, especially among previously disengaged students. David watched from the sidelines, taking in the scene with mixed emotions. The festival represented undeniable progress, but he also knew the work was far from complete. Just last week, there had been a heated debate about resource allocation for ESL programs. Yet even that debate felt different now, more productive, more focused on solutions than accusations. Carla approached him, holding a thick binder. "The Education Board wants to implement our program district-wide," she said, pointing to various statistics. "Our documentation of the process has been crucial. They're calling it the Los Angeles Elementary Model." Mrs. Thompson, who had become one of the most ardent supporters of the changes, was running a booth about cultural sensitivity in education. She shared her story openly, using her experience as a teaching moment. "It's not about being perfect," she told visitors. "It's about being willing to learn and change." The podcast booth, where Maya and Elena's initiative had grown into a weekly production involving dozens of students, drew constant crowds. They were broadcasting live, interviewing students, parents, and teachers about their experiences with the school's transformation. A Chinese student spoke about no longer feeling embarrassed to bring traditional lunches to school. A Muslim student described being able to pray during breaks without fear of judgment. A transgender student shared how the new inclusive policies had made them feel safer. Parents of different backgrounds discussed how their children's academic performance and emotional well-being had improved. Dr. Roberts took the stage after Maya, sharing official data that supported what everyone could see. Disciplinary incidents were down 45%. Parent involvement had increased by 80%. Teacher retention rates had improved. The school had become a model for inclusive education, with educators from other districts visiting to learn from their example. But perhaps the most visible impact was in the small, everyday moments. Students naturally mixing acros, cultural and racial lines during lunch and recess. Teachers confidently handling difficult conversations about diversity. Parents from different backgrounds forming friendships and support networks. Students standing up for each other when they witnessed unfair treatment. The local news crew covering the festival interviewed Maya. "What's different now?" they asked. "Everything," she replied simply. "Before, we were all trying to fit into someone else's idea of normal. Now we get to be ourselves, and that's what's normal." The festival continued into the evening, with performances showcasing different cultural traditions. What struck many observers was how naturally the students moved between different cultural expressions, showing respect and genuine interest rather than awkward tolerance. David found himself standing next to Mrs. Thompson as they watched Maya lead a group activity. "I never thanked you," he said quietly. "Thank me?" she asked, surprised. "For what?" "For being willing to change. For showing others it was possible." The impact of the school's transformation had begun to ripple outward. Other schools were implementing similar programs. Parents reported carrying these conversations into their workplaces. Students were teaching their families about respect and inclusion. As the festival wound down, Maya and Elena gathered their student committee for a group photo. Looking at them, confident, united, proud, it was clear that the most significant impact wasn't in the statistics or programs, but in the fundamental shift in how these young people saw themselves and each other. A week after the successful Cultural Unity Festival, David arrived early for a routine committee meeting. The school hallways were quiet, decorated with photos from the festival and student artwork. As he passed the teacher's lounge, he overheard two teaching assistants in intense conversation. One was holding a phone, showing something to the other. "Have you seen this video? It's from last semester," one whispered. "Someone just posted it on the parent group chat." David might have walked past, but he heard Mrs. Thompson's name. He paused, just out of sight, as the teaching assistants played the video again. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Mrs. Thompson in her classroom 3 months before the mud incident, speaking to another teacher. Her words, caught clearly on the recording, made David's blood run cold. "These diversity requirements are ridiculous." Mrs. Thompson's voice rang out from the phone speaker. "I've been teaching this way for 20 years. Now suddenly everything has to be culturally sensitive. These kids need to learn to adapt to our standards, not the other way around." The video continued, showing Mrs. Thompson mocking a student's accent, making disparaging remarks about ethnic hairstyles, and laughing about parents who make everything about race. The timestamp showed this was recorded just weeks before the mud incident with Maya. David's hands clenched into fists. The teaching assistants, finally noticing his presence, fell silent. Within hours, the video had spread through the entire school community. Parents were calling for immediate action. The transformation they'd worked so hard for suddenly felt hollow. Carla called an emergency committee meeting. The library, usually a space of progress and collaboration, now crackled with tension. Mrs. Thompson sat alone in the corner, her face ashen. The room was divided between those calling for her immediate dismissal and others arguing that her recent work in promoting change deserved consideration. "How can we trust anything she's done?" one parent demanded. This wasn't just unconscious bias. This was deliberate prejudice. Maya, who had insisted on attending, watched silently as the adults argued. The student committee members huddled together, their recent pride in their achievements shaken by this revelation. Dr. Roberts tried to maintain order. "We need to approach this with the same principles of fairness and justice we've been promoting," he began, but was interrupted by the arrival of more parents, phones in hand, showing additional videos and screenshots of Mrs. Thompson's past behavior. David finally stood up, the room falling silent. "I've been thinking about redemption," he said slowly, "about whether it's possible and what it requires." He turned to face Mrs. Thompson. "You've done good work these past months. Real work. But you owe this community the truth. All of it." Mrs. Thompson rose shakily. "I was wrong," she began, her voice breaking. "Not just about the mud incident. About everything. I held those beliefs for years. I acted on them. I hurt students, and I didn't care." She paused, tears streaming down her face. "The mud incident wasn't an accident. Part of me wanted to put Maya in her place. I didn't admit that to myself until now." The confession hit the room like a physical force. Parents who had defended her looked stunned. Those who had suspected deeper issues felt vindicated but not satisfied. Carla spoke next, her legal training evident in her measured tone. "We have two issues here. First, the direct harm caused to students over years. That requires accountability. Second, the question of whether someone who has caused harm can be part of healing it." Maya stood up, her voice clear in the tense room. "You taught us about restorative justice in our committee meetings," she said, "about how punishment without change doesn't fix anything. But you also taught us that change without accountability isn't enough." The community wrestled with this challenge for hours. Finally, a decision was reached. Mrs. Thompson would resign from her teaching position, but would continue to work with the Diversity Committee as a public example of how deeply rooted prejudices could be acknowledged and overcome. Her story would become part of the school's training materials, a raw and honest testimony about the journey from bias to awareness. David watched as she cleaned out her classroom the next day. "You understand why this had to happen?" he asked. "I do," she replied quietly. Real change isn't just about doing better. It's about facing who you were and who you want to become. The school community emerged from this final revelation stronger, though not unscathed. The incident reinforced the importance of their work and the need for constant vigilance against hidden biases. Maya's podcast dedicated several episodes to discussing the revelation, creating a space for students to process their feelings about trust, forgiveness, and genuine change. As David drove home with Maya that evening, she asked, "Dad, did we fail? Everything we built feels different now." "No, Maya," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "We just learned that real change is harder and goes deeper than we thought. But that makes it more important, not less." The story of Los Angeles Elementary's transformation became more complex, but also more honest. It wasn't just about one incident with mud, or one teacher's journey, or one community's awakening. It was about the long, difficult process of confronting deep-seated prejudices and the courage required to create genuine change, even when that change reveals uncomfortable truths about ourselves and others.